The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and diesel fuel as Hospital Corpsman Second Class Maria Santos adjusted her medical kit one final time. At 5'4" and barely 130 pounds, she stood among the towering figures of SEAL Team 7 like a sparrow among hawks. The other members of the unit exchanged glances, some skeptical, others protective, but all wondering the same thing. Could this small woman really handle what was coming? "Santos, you sure you're ready for this?" Chief Petty Officer Jackson asked, his weathered face creased with concern. The mission briefing had been clear. They were heading into hostile territory in Afghanistan's Kunar province, where intel suggested a high-value target was hiding in a remote compound. The terrain was unforgiving, the enemy well-entrenched, and casualties were not just possible, they were probable. Maria had heard the whispers throughout her deployment. She's too small. What if she can't carry a wounded SEAL? This isn't a job for women. Each comment had stung, but they had also forged something unbreakable within her, a determination to prove that heroism isn't measured in pounds or inches, but in heart and training. "I've trained for this my entire career, Chief," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. "I didn't come this far to back down now." The truth was, Maria Santos had been fighting uphill battles her entire life. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, she had watched her single mother work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Education was her ticket out, but even in high school, teachers had suggested she pursue more realistic goals when she expressed interest in military medicine. "Girls like you should think about nursing or teaching," one guidance counselor had said, completely missing the fire that burned behind Maria's quiet demeanor. But Maria had a secret weapon that her critics couldn't see, an obsessive dedication to excellence that had driven her to graduate top of her class from Hospital Corps School. While other students were socializing or sleeping, Maria was in the library, memorizing every medical procedure, every emergency protocol, every piece of equipment she might need to save a life. She had studied trauma medicine with the intensity of a scholar and trained her body with the discipline of an athlete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as the team prepared for insertion. Maria checked her medical supplies one last time. Trauma bandages, hemostatic agents, airway management tools, and enough morphine to treat multiple casualties. Her pack weighed nearly 60 pounds, but she had trained with twice that weight during her preparation for this deployment. Every piece of equipment had been placed with surgical precision. She could find any item blindfolded, which might prove necessary in the chaos of combat. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez gathered the team for final instructions. "This is a straightforward extraction mission," he said, his voice barely audible over the aircraft noise. "Intelligence indicates our target is in the northern building of the compound. We go in fast, secure the asset, and exfiltrate before enemy reinforcements arrive. Questions?" The SEALs shook their heads, their faces painted with determination and war paint. These were men who had trained for years to become the elite of the elite, warriors who could swim for miles, run marathons, and engage multiple enemies simultaneously. And yet, in this moment, their lives might depend on the skills of the smallest person among them. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before every mission. Her hands were steady, her mind clear, and her heart rate controlled despite the circumstances. This was what she had trained for, what she had dreamed about during those long nights studying in Corps School. She wasn't just a medic, she was their lifeline, their insurance policy against the unthinkable. The insertion went smoothly, with the team fast roping into the compound under cover of darkness. Maria hit the ground with practiced ease, immediately establishing security while scanning for potential casualty collection points. Her training had taught her to think like a chess player, always 3 moves ahead, always considering where the wounded might fall and how she would reach them. The compound was larger than the intelligence photos had suggested, with multiple buildings connected by narrow alleyways and countless hiding spots for enemy combatants. The team moved with the fluid precision of a well-oiled machine, each member knowing their role and trusting their teammates to execute theirs. Maria stayed close to the center of the formation, ready to respond to any call for medical assistance. But as they approached the target building, the silence that had welcomed them began to feel ominous. Intel had suggested minimal resistance, but Maria's instincts, honed by months of combat deployments, told her something wasn't right. The compound was too quiet, too empty, too perfect. The first shots rang out like thunder in the pre-dawn darkness, shattering the mission's carefully planned silence. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the compound, turning what should have been a straightforward extraction into a nightmare scenario. Maria dropped to a prone position behind a concrete barrier, her medical training immediately shifting into combat mode as bullets whistled overhead. "Contact front! Multiple shooters!" shouted Petty Officer Thompson, the team's point man, as he returned fire toward the northern building. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of RPGs, creating a symphony of violence that echoed off the compound's walls. Chief Jackson's voice cut through the chaos on the radio. "We're compromised. This was a setup. Enemy combatants in all buildings. At least 30 hostiles." The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of finding a single high-value target with minimal security, SEAL Team 7 had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. Maria pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing through contingency plans. She could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars, followed by explosions that shook the ground beneath her. Dust and debris filled the air, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had kept her awake during training, a complex ambush with multiple casualties in a hostile environment. "Corpsman, man down!" The call came from the eastern side of the compound, where Petty Officer Davis had been providing overwatch. She could see him writhing on the ground, blood already pooling beneath his left leg. Without hesitation, she sprinted across 30 yards of open ground, enemy bullets kicking up dirt around her feet. She reached Davis just as another volley of gunfire erupted from a nearby window. "Where are you hit?" she shouted over the noise, her hands already working to assess his injuries. A high-velocity round had shattered his femur, causing massive tissue damage and arterial bleeding. This was a life-threatening wound that required immediate attention. Working with practiced efficiency, Maria applied a tourniquet above the wound site, then began packing the injury with hemostatic gauze. Davis groaned in pain, his face pale from blood loss, but Maria's training had taught her to compartmentalize. Right now, he was a medical problem to be solved, not a teammate in agony. "Thompson, I need suppressing fire on that window," she called out, continuing to work on Davis's leg. The SEAL immediately began laying down accurate fire, forcing the enemy shooters to take cover. Maria used the brief respite to establish an IV line and begin fluid replacement therapy. But as she worked, more calls for medical assistance began flooding the radio. "Corpsman to the north wall! Rodriguez is hit! Medical emergency at the breach point! Santos, we need you everywhere!" The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. Multiple casualties, limited cover, and enemy forces closing in from all sides. This was every combat medic's worst nightmare, but it was also what she had trained for during countless exercises and simulations. The question wasn't whether she was skilled enough, but if she was strong enough to reach them all. She finished stabilizing Davis and helped him to a more defensible position behind a concrete planter. "Stay here and keep pressure on that wound," she instructed, then began moving toward the next casualty. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez had taken shrapnel to his torso and arm, the result of an RPG that had detonated against the building he was using for cover. Maria low-crawled across broken glass and twisted metal, her medical pack scraping against the ground as enemy fire continued to rake their position. When she reached Rodriguez, she could see multiple penetrating wounds across his chest and abdomen. This was beyond field medicine. He needed immediate surgical intervention that she couldn't provide in a combat zone. "How bad is it, Doc?" Rodriguez asked through gritted teeth, his breathing shallow and labored. Maria could hear the wet rattle that indicated lung involvement, possibly a pneumothorax. "You're going to be fine, sir," she lied, her hands working to seal the chest wounds with occlusive dressings. She established another IV line and began pushing blood expanders, knowing that every second counted. The third call came from Sergeant Martinez, who had been caught in the blast radius of the same RPG that had wounded Rodriguez. He was conscious, but disoriented, with obvious signs of traumatic brain injury and severe lacerations across his face and arms. Maria realized she was looking at the impossible equation that every combat medic dreaded: multiple critical casualties requiring simultaneous treatment with no backup and no way to evacuate. As she moved between the wounded SEALs, applying tourniquets, establishing airways, and administering pain medication, Maria became aware of a horrible truth. Chief Jackson was also down, hit by sniper fire while trying to coordinate the team's defense. 4 of the 8-man team were now casualties, and the enemy was closing in for a final assault. The compound's walls seemed to be shrinking around them as enemy forces moved closer. Maria could hear Arabic commands being shouted in the distance, the sound of boots on gravel, and the metallic click of weapons being reloaded. They had perhaps minutes before being overrun. The situation had deteriorated beyond anything Maria had experienced in her previous deployments. 4 SEALs lay wounded around the compound: Davis with his shattered femur, Rodriguez fighting for breath with chest wounds, Martinez drifting in and out of consciousness from his head trauma, and Chief Jackson bleeding from a sniper's bullet that had found its mark in his shoulder and upper chest. The remaining team members, Thompson, Wilson, Garcia, and Kowalski, were desperately trying to hold their perimeter against an enemy force that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. The distinctive sound of diesel engines in the distance meant reinforcements were arriving, and their window for escape was closing rapidly. "Santos!" Thompson shouted over the gunfire. "We need to move these casualties now, or we're all dead!" Maria looked around at her patients, her mind calculating medical priorities with the cold precision her training had instilled. Rodriguez was the most critical. His breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and she suspected internal bleeding that would kill him within the hour without surgical intervention. Davis was stable for now, but losing blood despite the tourniquet. Martinez kept trying to stand up, his brain injury making him combative and confused. Jackson was alert, but weakening from blood loss. The standard protocol was clear. In a mass casualty event, you prioritize those most likely to survive with treatment. But looking at these 4 men, warriors who had become like brothers during their deployment, Maria knew she couldn't make that choice. She wouldn't leave anyone behind. "I need 5 minutes to stabilize them for transport," she called back to Thompson, already moving toward Rodriguez with a chest decompression kit. His breathing had become so labored that she suspected a tension pneumothorax, air trapped in his chest cavity, compressing his lungs and heart. Working by feel in the darkness, Maria located the correct intercostal space and inserted a needle to relieve the pressure. The immediate improvement in Rodriguez's breathing confirmed her diagnosis. She followed up with a chest seal to prevent air from re-entering the cavity, then moved to check on the others. The sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder. Maria could see headlights bouncing along the rough road that led to the compound, at least 3 trucks, probably carrying 20 or more enemy combatants. Their ammunition was running low, and the defensible positions were becoming untenable. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they're on top of us," Garcia reported, reloading his rifle with one of his last magazines. "The bird can't get back in here with all this ground fire. We need to move to the alternate LZ." The alternate landing zone was nearly a mile away across rough terrain that would challenge healthy SEALs under normal circumstances. With 4 casualties, it might as well have been on the moon. Maria looked at her wounded teammates and felt something shift inside her, a quiet determination that had been building throughout her career. "How much does Rodriguez weigh?" she asked Thompson. "About 200 pounds. Why?" "And Davis?" "Maybe 180. Santos, what are you thinking?" Maria was thinking about every moment of doubt, every questioning look, every comment about her size and strength. She was thinking about her mother, working 3 jobs and never giving up. She was thinking about her drill instructors who had pushed her beyond her limits, and her medical instructors who had taught her that a corpsman never abandons their Marines.
I'm thinking we're all going home today, she said, checking her gear one final time. Thompson, I need you and Garcia to carry Rodriguez between you. Wilson takes Martinez. I'll handle Davis and Jackson. Santos, that's impossible, Kowalski protested. Davis alone weighs more than you do, and Jackson's dead weight right now. Then we'd better prove everyone wrong, Maria replied, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The enemy vehicles were close enough now that Maria could hear individual voices, the slam of doors and the sound of weapons being prepared. Thompson was coordinating what defensive fire they could manage, but everyone knew they had minutes at most before being overwhelmed. Maria knelt beside Davis, whose pain medication was beginning to wear off. She told him quietly, I need you to help me as much as you can. Put your arm around my shoulders and try to support some of your own weight. Davis looked at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Doc, I'm twice your size. This is crazy. Crazy is my specialty, Maria replied, positioning herself to take his weight. The physics were against her. Davis was nearly 180 pounds of muscle and gear, while she weighed barely 130 pounds soaking wet. But Maria had spent months preparing for this moment, building functional strength that went beyond what her frame suggested. She had studied the mechanics of carrying casualties, practiced with weighted dummies until her back ached, and developed techniques that leveraged her entire body rather than relying solely on upper body strength. More importantly, she had developed something that couldn't be measured in a gym, an unshakable will to succeed. As the first enemy combatants began advancing on their position, Maria Santos prepared to attempt something that would either save 4 lives or cost 5. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of automatic weapons fire and the determined breathing of a small woman about to prove that heroism comes in all sizes. The first casualty evacuation began with Davis, whose femur fracture made it impossible for him to support his own weight effectively. Maria positioned herself beside him, wrapping his arm around her shoulders while gripping his tactical vest with both hands. The technique she employed wasn't the standard fireman's carry. It was a modified dragon carry method she had developed during her training, distributing his weight across her entire body rather than relying on her back alone. On 3, she whispered to Davis, who was gritting his teeth against the pain. 1, 2, 3. Maria stood up, her legs trembling under the combined weight but holding firm. Davis tried to hop on his good leg, but even that small movement sent waves of agony through his body. What followed was a painstaking journey across 50 yards of broken concrete and scattered debris, with enemy muzzle flashes lighting up the compound around them. Thompson provided covering fire, his rifle barking steadily as enemy combatants tried to flank their position. Move! 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 He shouted, laying down suppressive fire on 2 advancing fighters who had made it to within 100 yards of their position. Each step was a battle against physics and pain. Maria's shoulders burned under Davis's weight, her legs shook with exhaustion, and her lungs gasped for air in the thin mountain atmosphere. But she had trained for this. Not just the physical demands, but the mental fortress required to push through when every muscle screamed for rest. Halfway to the rally point, Davis began to lose consciousness from blood loss, despite the tourniquet. His full weight suddenly shifted onto Maria's small frame, nearly sending them both to the ground. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might collapse under the load, but she adjusted her grip and kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. "I've got him stable," she called out when they finally reached the temporary casualty collection point behind a stone wall. But there was no time to rest. Chief Jackson was losing blood at an alarming rate, and the enemy cordon was tightening around their position. Jackson was conscious but weak, his face pale in the moonlight. The sniper's bullet had done significant damage to his shoulder and upper chest, and Maria suspected it might have nicked a major blood vessel. Unlike Davis, Jackson could at least stand briefly, but his left arm was completely useless. "Chief, I need you to stay awake and help me as much as possible," Maria said, checking his pulse and finding it rapid and thready, classic signs of hypovolemic shock. "We're going to lean on each other and make it to safety." "Santos," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gunfire, "I don't have to do this. Leave me and save the others." "That's not how this works, Chief," Maria replied firmly, adjusting her medical pack and preparing for the second evacuation. "We all go home, or nobody goes home." This carry was different from the first. Jackson was heavier than Davis, nearly 200 pounds of muscle and equipment, but he was conscious and could provide some assistance. Maria used a technique called the ranger carry, supporting Jackson under his good arm while he tried to help with his legs. The journey back across the compound was even more harrowing than the first. Enemy fire was intensifying, and Maria could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars. One landed close enough to shower them with dirt and rocks, but Maria kept moving, her determination overriding the fear that clawed at her mind. Jackson stumbled several times, his strength fading with each step. During one particularly close call, when an enemy fighter appeared at the corner of a building less than 30 yards away from their position, Thompson's precision shooting saved their lives. The sniper's bullet found its mark, but Maria knew they were running out of time and luck. When they finally reached the casualty collection point, Maria had to immediately shift her attention to Rodriguez, whose breathing had become increasingly labored despite the chest decompression. His lips were taking on a blue tinge that indicated inadequate oxygenation, and she could hear the wet rattle of blood in his airways. "Rodriguez needs immediate medical attention," she called out to the team. "I'm seeing signs of massive internal bleeding, possible hemothorax in addition to the pneumothorax." Using her tactical flashlight with a red filter to avoid compromising their position, Maria performed another assessment of Rodriguez's chest wounds. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The shrapnel had caused multiple penetrating injuries, and blood was beginning to fill his chest cavity. Working with practiced efficiency in the darkness, Maria inserted a second chest tube to drain the accumulated blood, a procedure that would be challenging in a fully equipped hospital, let alone in a combat zone under enemy fire. Rodriguez groaned as she worked, but the immediate improvement in his breathing told her the intervention was successful. "That's 3 down, 1 to go," she said to herself, looking over at Martinez, who was sitting against the wall, still disoriented from his head trauma. The blast had left him with severe lacerations across his face and arms, and his pupils were unequal, a sign of potential brain swelling that could be fatal. Martinez was the lightest of the 4 casualties, at around 170 pounds, but his head injury made him unpredictable and combative. Brain-injured patients often fought against assistance, not understanding that help was being offered. Maria would need to be especially careful to maintain control during the evacuation. The sound of diesel engines was getting closer, and the volume of incoming fire was increasing exponentially. Through her night vision goggles, Maria could see enemy fighters moving methodically through the compound, searching each room and advancing toward their position with military precision.
Martinez proved to be Maria's most challenging patient to evacuate. The head trauma had left him confused and agitated, swinging between moments of clarity and periods of complete disorientation. When Maria approached him for the evacuation, he initially tried to push her away, mumbling incoherently about enemies and thinking she was a hostile combatant. "Martinez, it's Doc Santos," she said firmly but gently, using his first name to try to cut through the confusion. "You're hurt, and I need to get you to safety. Can you understand me?" His eyes focused on her for a moment, recognition flickering across his battered face. "Doc, where are we? I can't remember." "We're getting you home," Maria replied, checking his pupils again with her penlight. The unequal dilation was worsening, which meant increasing intracranial pressure. If they didn't get him to a neurosurgeon soon, he could suffer permanent brain damage or death. Unlike the previous evacuations, Maria had to essentially guide Martinez rather than carry him. He could walk, but his balance was severely compromised and he had no sense of direction or danger. She wrapped his arm around her shoulders and gripped his belt, half supporting and half guiding him across the treacherous terrain. "Thompson, I need continuous covering fire for this one. Martinez can't take cover if we come under direct fire." The journey with Martinez became a nightmare of near misses and close calls. Twice, enemy combatants appeared in their path, only to be eliminated by precise shooting from Thompson and Wilson. Once, Martinez suddenly stopped walking and sat down in the middle of open ground, forcing Maria to physically drag him behind cover while bullets whistled overhead. "I'm tired, Duck," Martinez said during one of his lucid moments. "Maybe I should just rest here for a while." "No rest until we're home," Maria replied, pulling him to his feet again.
Your wife is waiting for you. Remember, Lisa and the kids need their daddy to come home." The mention of his family seemed to cut through the fog in Martinez's brain. He straightened up slightly and began walking with more purpose, though Maria still had to guide every step. They covered the remaining distance in a series of rushes between cover, with Maria essentially willing Martinez forward through sheer determination. When they finally reached the casualty collection point, Maria had successfully evacuated all 4 wounded SEALs, but their situation remained desperate. The enemy cordon was tightening, ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the alternate landing zone was still nearly a mile away through hostile territory. "Santos," Thompson said, reloading his rifle with what appeared to be his last magazine, "I don't know how you did that, but now we need a miracle to get everyone out of here." Maria looked at her 4 casualties, all stable for the moment but requiring immediate medical evacuation. Davis was holding steady with his femoral fracture. Rodriguez was breathing easier with the chest tubes. Jackson was conscious but weak from blood loss, and Martinez was becoming more alert as the adrenaline helped clear his head. "The miracle is that we're all still alive," Maria replied, checking each casualty's vital signs one more time. "Now we need to figure out how to stay that way." The radio crackled with static before a familiar voice cut through the interference. "Nighthawk 7, this is Dustoff 2-4. Do you copy?" It was the medical evacuation helicopter, attempting to coordinate a pickup despite the intense ground fire. The pilot's voice was calm and professional, but Maria could hear the underlying tension of someone flying into an extremely dangerous situation. "Copy, Nighthawk 7. Be advised, we're taking heavy ground fire attempting to approach primary LZ. We'll attempt pickup at alternate location, but you need to get there fast. Enemy reinforcements are massing on all approaches." The alternate landing zone was positioned on a ridge nearly a mile from their current location. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging hike for healthy SEALs. With 4 casualties, it seemed impossible. But Maria Santos had spent her entire career proving that impossible was just another word for untested. She began organizing the evacuation with the methodical precision of a battlefield surgeon, assigning roles and responsibilities to maximize their chances of success. "Thompson and Garcia will carry Rodriguez on a makeshift stretcher," she announced. "Wilson takes Martinez. I'll handle Davis and Jackson simultaneously." "Doc, that's not physically possible," Wilson protested. "You just carried each of them individually and that nearly killed you. Both at the same time will definitely kill you." Maria looked at the 2 SEALs, with Davis with his shattered leg and Jackson weak from blood loss, and calculated the physics involved. Combined, they weighed nearly 380 pounds, more than 3 times her own body weight. Every principle of biomechanics said it was impossible. But Maria had learned something during her individual evacuations that surprised even her. When everything was on the line, when lives hung in balance, the human body could transcend its apparent limitations. She had carried men twice her size across hostile ground under enemy fire, not through superhuman strength, but through superior technique, unshakable will, and the kind of determination that turns ordinary people into heroes. "Wilson," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute conviction, "I didn't survive everything we've been through tonight just to leave anyone behind now. Help me figure out how to make this work."
The evacuation to the alternate landing zone required Maria to attempt something that defied not just common sense, but the basic laws of physics. Supporting both Davis and Jackson simultaneously meant managing nearly 380 pounds of dead weight across a mile of rocky terrain, under enemy fire, while maintaining medical oversight of all 4 casualties. Maria studied the 2 men, her mind working through mechanical solutions with the precision of an engineer. Davis could still hop on his good leg for short distances, but his shattered femur made sustained movement impossible. Jackson was conscious, but growing weaker by the minute, his blood loss making him increasingly unsteady. "Here's what we're going to do," she announced, surprising everyone with the calm authority in her voice. "Jackson, you're going to lean on me from the left side. Davis, I'm going to support your weight from the right, and you're going to hop when I tell you to hop. We're going to move in coordinated segments. 10 steps, then rest, then 10 more steps." "Doc, the math doesn't work," Garcia protested, adjusting his grip on the makeshift stretcher they had constructed for Rodriguez from tent poles and ponchos. "Even if you could support that much weight, which you can't, we don't have time for 10 steps and rest. The enemy will be on us in minutes." Maria looked around at the SEALs, men she had served with for months, warriors who had become like brothers, and saw something in their eyes she had never seen before. Not doubt about her capabilities, not protective concern about her limitations, but genuine respect for what she had already accomplished. These elite soldiers, trained to be skeptical of anything that seemed impossible, were beginning to believe that Maria Santos might actually pull off the impossible. "Then we don't rest," she said simply, positioning herself between Davis and Jackson. "We move continuously until we reach the LZ." The first 100 yards nearly ended the evacuation before it truly began. Both casualties were heavier than they had been during the individual evacuations. Davis, because his pain medication was wearing off and he could provide less assistance. Jackson, because blood loss was making him increasingly weak and unsteady. Maria felt her legs trembling under the combined load, her shoulders burning with the strain. But she had discovered something during the earlier evacuations that transformed her understanding of human potential. When faced with truly impossible circumstances, when the stakes involved life and death, the body could access reserves of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond muscle and bone. It was as if pure determination could temporarily rewrite the rules of physics. Enemy muzzle flashes continued to light up the compound behind them, and Maria could hear the distinctive sound of combat boots on gravel as hostile forces pursued them up the mountain. Thompson and the remaining SEALs were providing a fighting withdrawal, laying down disciplined fire to keep the pursuers at a respectable distance. "Contact rear," Wilson called out, engaging two enemy fighters who had gotten too close to the casualty column. His M4 rifle barked twice, and the threat disappeared, but everyone knew more would follow. 200 yards into the evacuation, Jackson began to lose consciousness again. His full weight suddenly shifted onto Maria's small frame, threatening to send all three of them tumbling down the rocky slope. For a terrifying moment, she thought they might all fall, but she adjusted her stance and kept moving, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "Stay with me, Chief," she whispered urgently. "Your daughter's getting married next month, remember? You told me you've been planning that speech for 2 years. Jackson's eyes fluttered open, and he managed a weak smile. "Can't miss that," he mumbled, trying to support more of his own weight. "She'd never forgive me." Davis was fighting his own battle against pain and exhaustion. Every hop on his good leg sent jolts of agony through his shattered femur. But he had seen what Maria was sacrificing for him and refused to give up. "Doc, you're the strongest person I've ever met." The praise meant more to Maria than all the medals and commendations she might eventually receive. These were SEALs, men who defined strength and courage in their daily lives, and they were calling her strong. Not strong for a woman or strong for her size, but simply strong. 300 yards from the compound, the evacuation faced its greatest test. An enemy mortar round landed close enough to shower the group with dirt and rocks, temporarily blinding Maria and causing both casualties to stumble. For a moment, all three were down in the loose shale, vulnerable and exposed. "I can't do this anymore," Davis said, blood seeping through his bandages. "Leave me here. Save Jackson." "Nobody gets left behind," Maria replied, struggling back to her feet and helping both men up. "We've come too far to quit now." But privately, she was beginning to wonder if Davis might be right. Her body was approaching complete exhaustion. Her legs felt like rubber, and they still had more than half a mile to go. The enemy pursuit was getting closer, ammunition was nearly exhausted, and she was asking her body to do something that might be genuinely impossible. Then she heard a sound that changed everything. The distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop-whoop of helicopter rotors in the distance. Dustoff 2-4 was inbound, racing against time and enemy fire to reach the alternate landing zone. "LZ is 5 minutes out," Thompson called over the radio chatter. "We need to move faster." Maria looked up the mountain toward their destination, then down at the 2 wounded SEALs depending on her. 5 more minutes, 500 more yards, just a little bit further than impossible. "Let's go home," she said, and began moving again with renewed determination.
The sound of the approaching helicopter gave Maria a surge of adrenaline that temporarily masked her physical exhaustion. Dusthoff 2-4 was still several minutes away, but knowing that salvation was coming made each step feel more achievable. However, the enemy forces pursuing them had also heard the helicopter, and their pursuit became more aggressive and organized. "They know we have an evac bird coming," Thompson reported over the radio, his voice strained from the running firefight he was conducting while moving up the mountain. "Enemy forces are attempting to cut us off from the LZ." Maria could hear the increased volume of gunfire behind them, and the distinctive crack of AK-47s was getting closer. The enemy wasn't just pursuing them anymore, they were trying to position themselves between the SEAL team and their escape route. 400 yards into the evacuation, Davis began to hyperventilate from pain and exhaustion. The combination of his shattered femur and the jarring movement up the rocky slope was pushing him beyond his limits. Maria could feel him becoming dead weight as his body began to shut down from trauma and blood loss. "Davis, look at me," Maria commanded, using her command voice that she had developed during medical training. "I need you to control your breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. The breathing technique worked, helping Davis regain some control over his panic response. But Maria could see that he was fading fast. His tourniquet had been in place for nearly an hour, and despite her field treatment, he was losing the battle against shock and blood loss. Jackson wasn't doing much better. The chest wound was more serious than she had initially assessed, and she suspected that the bullet might have damaged his lung more extensively than the field treatment could address. His breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and his skin was taking on the grayish pallor that indicated insufficient oxygen circulation. "Doc," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire, "maybe Wilson was right. Maybe you should leave us and save yourself." "Chief, I've been carrying your ugly face this far. I'm not about to drop you now and ruin my perfect record." The joke earned her a weak laugh from Jackson, but she could see that he was serious about his suggestion. These SEALs would rather die than put her at additional risk, but Maria had made a decision back in the compound that she wouldn't abandon. Her mother had taught her that some principles were more important than survival, and leaving wounded teammates was a line she would never cross. 500 yards from the compound, the evacuation took on an almost surreal quality. Maria found herself moving in a rhythm that seemed to transcend her physical limitations. Each step became automatic, each breath coordinated with the movement of her patients. Each yard covered through sheer force of will rather than muscular strength. She had entered what psychologists call flow state, a mental condition where conscious thought gives way to automatic performance. Her medical training, her physical conditioning, and her unshakable determination had combined into something that allowed her to accomplish what should have been impossible. The enemy pursuit was getting closer, but Thompson and the remaining SEALs were conducting a masterful fighting withdrawal. They would establish a defensive position, allow the casualties to move past them, then leapfrog to the next defensive position while their teammates provided covering fire. It was a textbook maneuver executed under the worst possible circumstances. 2 minutes to LZ, Garcia called out, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "I can see the strobes!" Maria looked up the mountain and could indeed see the infrared strobes that marked their destination. The alternate landing zone was a small clearing, barely large enough for a helicopter, surrounded by rocks and trees that would make the approach extremely dangerous for the pilot. But as they climbed higher, a new problem emerged. The enemy had anticipated their route and positioned fighters along the ridgeline near the landing zone. Maria could see muzzle flashes from elevated positions that would make the helicopter approach extremely dangerous. Dusthoff 2-4, be advised that LZ is under direct fire. Multiple shooters on the ridgeline were working to suppress them. Copy, Nighthawk 7. Came the pilot's calm response. "We're coming in anyway. Have your casualties ready for immediate loading."
Maria felt a surge of respect for the helicopter crew. Flying into a hot landing zone to evacuate wounded soldiers was one of the most dangerous missions in military aviation, but these aviators were willing to risk their lives for 4 SEALs they had never met. The final approach to the landing zone became a race against time and ammunition. The remaining SEALs were down to their last magazines, the enemy was closing in from multiple directions, and Maria's body was operating on nothing but willpower and adrenaline. 100 yards, Wilson called out, pointing toward the small clearing where they could see the helicopter's lights approaching through the darkness.
The last 100 yards to the landing zone represented the steepest and most treacherous part of their climb. The rocky slope was covered with loose shale that shifted under their feet, making every step a potential disaster. Maria's legs were trembling with exhaustion. Her shoulders were on fire from supporting the 2 casualties, and her lungs burned in the thin mountain air. But she could hear the helicopter getting closer, its engines straining against the altitude and the weight of its medical equipment. Dustoff 24 was risking everything to reach them, and Maria was determined not to let their sacrifice be in vain. "Come on, boys," she whispered to Davis and Jackson, both of whom were barely conscious now. "We're almost home, just a little bit further." The enemy fire was intensifying as they approached the landing zone. Maria could hear bullets whistling past her head and see dirt kicking up around their feet. The hostile forces had positioned themselves in a semicircle around the clearing, creating a deadly crossfire that the helicopter would have to fly through. Thompson and Garcia were providing covering fire, but their ammunition situation was critical. Each shot had to count. Each target had to be a confirmed threat. There was no room for suppressive fire or warning shots. Every bullet had to save a life. 30 seconds, Thompson called out, pointing toward the approaching helicopter. Maria could see its landing lights cutting through the darkness, the pilot making an approach that was nothing short of suicidal given the amount of ground fire. 20 yards from the landing zone, Jackson collapsed completely. His weight suddenly shifted fully onto Maria's small frame, threatening to send both casualties tumbling down the mountainside. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might lose them both, but she managed to brace herself against a large rock and maintain her grip. "I can't make it, Doc," Jackson whispered, his face gray with blood loss. "Just get Davis to the bird." "We're all getting on that helicopter," Maria replied firmly, adjusting her grip and preparing for the final push. "Nobody gets left behind, remember?" The helicopter was now visible overhead, its pilot performing an incredibly dangerous approach to the small landing zone. Enemy tracers were reaching up toward the aircraft like deadly fireworks, and Maria could see the door gunners returning fire with their M240 machine guns. 10 yards from the clearing, Davis tried to help by hopping faster on his good leg, but the movement sent him into shock from the pain. He began to hyperventilate again, his body's systems shutting down from trauma and exhaustion. "Stay with me, Davis," Maria called out, her own voice strained from the enormous physical effort. "Your kids need their daddy to come home. Think about them." The mention of his children seemed to cut through Davis's shock, and he managed to focus long enough to help with the final approach to the landing zone. Maria could see the helicopter crew chief gesturing frantically for them to hurry, the aircraft hovering just a few feet off the ground to minimize its time in the target zone. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Maria made a decision that would haunt her for years afterward. She couldn't carry both casualties to the helicopter simultaneously. The distance was too great, the ground too unstable, and her strength finally reaching its absolute limit. "Garcia," she shouted over the noise of the helicopter, "help me with Jackson." Garcia immediately dropped his rifle and sprinted to Maria's position, grabbing Jackson under his good arm. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged the wounded SEAL toward the helicopter, while Thompson and Wilson provided covering fire. That left Davis, alone at the edge of the clearing, unable to walk and vulnerable to enemy fire. Maria looked back at him, seeing the understanding in his eyes. He knew what she was thinking, and he was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. "Go," Davis shouted, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "Get the others out of here." But Maria Santos had not carried 4 wounded SEALs up a mountain just to abandon one of them at the finish line. As soon as Garcia had Jackson secured in the helicopter, she turned around and sprinted back toward Davis, ignoring the bullets that were now impacting all around the landing zone.
The 20 yards back to Davis felt like 20 miles. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, her vision was tunneling from fatigue, and her body was operating on nothing but pure determination. Enemy fire was so intense that she could feel the heat from passing bullets, but she kept running. She reached Davis just as an RPG exploded against a nearby rock, showering them both with debris. Without hesitation, she grabbed his tactical vest and began dragging him toward the helicopter, using a technique that distributed his weight across the ground rather than trying to lift him. "Doc, this is crazy," Davis protested, but he was too weak to resist her efforts. "Crazy is what I do best," Maria replied, pulling him across the rocky ground with strength she didn't know she still possessed. The helicopter crew chief was now out of the aircraft, providing covering fire with his M4 rifle and gesturing frantically for them to hurry. The pilot was struggling to maintain his hover in the face of intense ground fire, and Maria could see that the aircraft had taken several hits. 10 yards from the helicopter, a sniper's bullet grazed Maria's shoulder, spinning her around and nearly causing her to lose her grip on Davis. Blood flowed down her arm, but the wound was superficial compared to what she had been treating all night. "5 more yards," the crew chief shouted, reaching out to help pull Davis into the aircraft. The helicopter's cabin became a scene of controlled chaos as Maria and the crew chief pulled Davis through the aircraft's side door. The wounded SEAL was barely conscious, his face pale from blood loss and shock, but he was alive and aboard the aircraft that would take him to definitive medical care. Maria collapsed against the helicopter's bulkhead, her body finally acknowledging the enormity of what she had just accomplished. Her shoulders were on fire, her legs were trembling uncontrollably, and her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely perform basic medical tasks. But all 4 casualties were aboard the aircraft, and they were all still breathing. "Holy hell, Doc!" the crew chief said, staring at Maria with obvious amazement. "I've been flying medevac missions for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like that." The helicopter lifted off immediately, its pilot desperate to get clear of the landing zone before enemy forces could bring more effective fire to bear. Through the cabin windows, Maria could see Thompson, Wilson, Garcia, and Kowalski making their way to a secondary extraction point, their own evacuation to be handled by a different aircraft. As they gained altitude, Maria began working on her patients with renewed focus. The helicopter was equipped with advanced medical equipment, including IV pumps, cardiac monitors, and a ventilator that could provide better respiratory support than her field equipment. Rodriguez was her primary concern. Despite the chest tube she had placed, his breathing remained labored, and she suspected internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. She started a second IV line and began pushing blood products, trying to replace what he had lost during the firefight and evacuation. Davis's femur fracture had been stabilized by her field treatment, but she could see signs of fat embolism, a potentially fatal complication where bone marrow enters the bloodstream. His oxygen saturation was dropping, and she could hear rails in his lungs that indicated fluid accumulation. Jackson's chest wound was more complex than she had initially realized. The bullet had created a through-and-through injury that had damaged multiple structures, and despite her field treatment, he was showing signs of continuing blood loss. She adjusted his chest tubes and increased his IV fluid rate. Martinez remained her most unpredictable patient. His head injury was serious enough to require immediate neurosurgical evaluation, and his periods of confusion were becoming more frequent and more severe. She administered medication to reduce brain swelling and monitored his neurological status closely. ETA to base hospital is 12 minutes, the pilot announced over the intercom. Trauma team is standing by, OR is prepped, and neurosurge is on standby. 12 minutes? Maria looked at her 4 patients and calculated whether they could all survive that long. Rodriguez was stable for now, but could deteriorate rapidly. Davis was fighting the complications of his fracture, but responding to treatment. Jackson was holding steady with his chest wounds. Martinez was alert, but needed immediate specialized care. As the helicopter raced through the darkness toward the military hospital, Maria found herself thinking about the events of the night. When she had first joined SEAL Team 7, the whispers were constant. "She's too small. What if she can't carry a wounded SEAL? This isn't a job for women." Tonight, she had carried 4 wounded SEALs to safety, single-handedly evacuating nearly 750 pounds of casualties across a mile of hostile territory under enemy fire. She had performed advanced medical procedures in combat conditions, made life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure, and proven that heroism has nothing to do with size or gender. But more than proving her critics wrong, Maria had discovered something profound about human potential. When faced with truly impossible circumstances, when lives hang in the balance, people can transcend their apparent limitations. The body can access reserves of strength that seem to defy physics, and the mind can maintain clarity in situations that should cause complete breakdown. "Doc," Davis whispered, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "Thank you." "Thank you for trusting me," Maria replied, checking his vital signs one more time. "Thank you for not giving up when it would have been easier." Similar conversations took place with each of the casualties as they approached the hospital. These warriors, men who had dedicated their lives to protecting others, were expressing gratitude to the small woman who had refused to leave them behind. Rodriguez managed a weak smile despite his oxygen mask. He said, "My wife is going to want to meet you. She needs to thank the person who brought her husband home." Jackson squeezed Maria's hand with his uninjured arm. "My daughter's wedding," he whispered. "I'm going to make it to my daughter's wedding." Even Martinez, in one of his lucid moments, understood what had happened. He said simply, "You saved us all. You saved us all." As the helicopter began its approach to the military hospital, Maria could see the trauma team assembled on the landing pad, ready to take over care of her patients. Surgeons, nurses, anesthesiologists, and technicians, all prepared to continue the fight for the lives that she had preserved. The landing was smooth, and within seconds, her casualties were being transferred to hospital gurneys and rushed toward the operating rooms. Maria watched them disappear into the hospital, knowing that she had done everything humanly possible to give them a chance at survival.
3 days later, Maria Santos sat in the hospital cafeteria, her left arm in a sling from the sniper's bullet that had grazed her shoulder during the final approach to the landing zone. The wound was superficial, but the doctors had insisted on keeping her for observation, concerned about exhaustion and the physical toll of her impossible evacuation mission. The news was better than she had dared hope. Rodriguez had undergone 6 hours of surgery to repair internal bleeding and lung damage, but he was stable and expected to make a full recovery. Davis had required orthopedic surgery to reconstruct his shattered femur, followed by treatment for fat embolism, but he would walk again. Jackson's chest wounds had been more complex than anticipated, requiring multiple procedures, but he was breathing on his own and talking about his daughter's upcoming wedding. Martinez had been the most touch-and-go case. Emergency neurosurgery had been required to relieve brain swelling, and for 24 hours, his outcome had been uncertain. But he had awakened the previous morning, recognized his wife, and asked for chocolate pudding, a request that had brought tears to the eyes of his surgical team. "All 4 are going to make it," Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen told Maria as she sat down at the cafeteria table. Dr. Chen was the chief of trauma surgery at the base hospital, a veteran of multiple deployments who had seen every kind of combat injury imaginable. "When they brought your casualties in," Dr. Chen continued, "I honestly didn't think we'd save them all. The combination of injuries, blood loss, and time elapsed should have been fatal for at least 2 of them, but your field treatment was so good, so precise, that you gave us something to work with." Maria nodded, still processing the enormity of what had happened. "I just did what I was trained to do," she said quietly. "No," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "What you did went far beyond training. I've been treating combat casualties for 15 years, and I've never seen field medicine at that level. More importantly, I've never seen someone physically carry that many casualties that distance under those conditions." Word of Maria's actions had spread throughout the base with the speed that only military communities can achieve. The story had grown in the telling. Some versions had her carrying all 4 SEALs simultaneously. Others described her treating casualties while returning enemy fire. But the core facts remained unchanged. One small Navy corpsman had single-handedly evacuated 4 wounded SEALs from a combat zone, saving all their lives.
The official after-action report was more restrained in its language, but no less impressive in its conclusions. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Santos demonstrated exceptional courage, superior medical knowledge, and extraordinary physical capability under extreme combat conditions. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of 4 critically wounded personnel and reflect the highest traditions of military service. But for Maria, the real validation came from her patients themselves. Each day, she visited them in their hospital rooms, checking on their progress and answering their questions about the evacuation. These conversations revealed something that the official reports couldn't capture: the deep bond that forms between a medic and the lives she has saved. "I keep thinking about that moment when you came back for me," Davis told her during one visit. "I was ready to die on that mountain, Doc. I had accepted it. But you wouldn't let me." "That's not who I am. That's not who any of us are. We don't leave people behind." Rodriguez had a different perspective on the events. He said, "I was conscious for most of it. I could hear everything, feel everything. I knew how badly I was hurt, and I knew how much you were struggling to carry us, but you never gave up, never even slowed down." Jackson's recovery was perhaps the most meaningful to Maria. The gruff chief petty officer had been skeptical of her abilities from the beginning, one of the voices questioning whether a woman could handle the physical demands of combat medicine. His transformation was complete. "I owe you an apology," he said during one of her visits. "I thought size and strength were the same thing. I thought courage was something that came with muscles and testosterone. You taught me that real strength comes from somewhere else entirely." The official awards and recognition would come later: the Navy Cross, the Purple Heart, promotion to Hospital Corpsman First Class, and speaking engagements at military medical schools across the country. But for Maria, the real reward was simpler: 4 lives saved, 4 families kept whole, 4 warriors who would go home to their loved ones. The story of Hospital Corpsman Maria Santos would become legendary within military medical circles, told and retold in training scenarios and case studies. It would inspire a generation of combat medics, both male and female, who learned that heroism isn't about meeting physical standards or conforming to stereotypes. It's about refusing to quit when lives are on the line. The 4 SEALs she saved would carry her story for the rest of their lives, sharing it with their children and grandchildren as an example of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat. But Maria's story didn't end with that night in Afghanistan. The events that followed would test her in ways that combat never could, and revealed that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not against enemies, but against the very system you've sworn to serve.
6 months after the mission that made her a legend, Hospital Corpsman First Class Maria Santos stood at attention in the dress blues she had pressed to perfection, waiting for her name to be called at the award ceremony. The Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, hung heavy in its presentation case, waiting to be pinned to her uniform by the Secretary of the Navy himself. The base auditorium was packed with military personnel, dignitaries, and media representatives who had come to witness the recognition of what many were calling the most heroic medical evacuation in modern military history. But as Maria stood there, listening to the citation being read aloud, she felt strangely disconnected from the proceedings. For extraordinary heroism while serving as hospital corpsman with a naval special warfare unit during combat operations against enemy forces, the secretary's voice echoed through the auditorium. Petty Officer Santos repeatedly exposed herself to intense enemy fire to provide medical treatment and evacuation to 4 critically wounded personnel. The words felt surreal, as if they were describing someone else's actions. Maria's mind wandered to the recovery ward, where she had spent countless hours visiting Rodriguez, Davis, Jackson, and Martinez during their rehabilitation. Those quiet conversations, away from the cameras and ceremonies, felt more real than any medal could ever be. Rodriguez had returned to his family in California, medically retired, but alive to see his children grow up.
Davis was walking again, though with a slight limp that would remind him forever of that night in the Afghan mountains. Jackson had indeed made it to his daughter's wedding, walking her down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Martinez had required months of cognitive rehabilitation, but he was sharp enough to joke about having the hardest head in the Navy. As the secretary pinned the Navy Cross to her uniform, Maria thought about the conversation she'd had with her mother the night before. Sophia Santos had flown in from Los Angeles for the ceremony. Her first time on a military base. Her first time seeing her daughter in dress blues. Mija, her mother had said, speaking in the mixture of Spanish and English that had filled Maria's childhood, I always knew you were strong, but I never imagined you were this strong. The pride in her mother's voice meant more to Maria than any medal ever could. This was the woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, who had sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities she never had. Seeing that pride in her mother's eyes validated every difficult moment of Maria's military career. But even as she accepted the accolades and posed for photographs with senior officers, Maria was aware of the whispers that continued to follow her. Some called her a hero, but others questioned whether the story had been exaggerated, whether one person could really have done what the reports claimed. Physics says it's impossible, she overheard one officer saying to another during the reception following the ceremony. A 130-pound woman carrying multiple casualties that distance? There has to be more to the story. The doubts stung, but it wasn't unexpected. Throughout her career, Maria had learned that some people would always find reasons to question achievements that didn't fit their preconceptions. She had proven herself in the most extreme circumstances possible, but there would always be those who chose skepticism over acceptance. What bothered her more was the way her story was being used. Military recruiters were featuring her in promotional materials, using her image to encourage young women to consider military service. While she supported that goal, she was uncomfortable with being turned into a symbol rather than being recognized as an individual who had done her job under extraordinary circumstances. The media attention was equally challenging. News outlets wanted to interview the tiny hero who saved the giants, focusing more on the apparent contradiction of her size versus her accomplishments than on the medical skills and training that had made her actions possible. She wanted to make it about gender, she confided to Rodriguez during one of his visits to the base. They want to make it about a story of a woman proving she's as good as men, instead of just a story about a medic doing their job. Rodriguez, who had returned to thank her personally for saving his life, understood her frustration. Doc, you know what really happened that night. We know what you did. That's what matters. But Maria was beginning to understand that her actions had implications far beyond the 4 lives she had saved. Young women in military medical programs were reaching out to her, sharing their own struggles with doubt and discrimination. They saw in her story proof that they could succeed in roles traditionally dominated by men. Letters arrived daily from aspiring medics, nurses, and doctors who had been told they were too small or not strong enough for their chosen careers. Each letter reminded Maria that her story had become bigger than herself, that her actions on that Afghan mountainside had opened doors for others who faced similar challenges. The responsibility was overwhelming at times. Maria had simply done what her training and conscience demanded, but now she found herself representing something larger, the potential for anyone to transcend apparent limitations when circumstances demanded it. As the months passed, Maria received new orders that would change her life once again. The Navy wanted her to become an instructor at the Hospital Corps School, where she could train the next generation of combat medics. It was an honor, but it also meant leaving the operational units where she felt most useful. The transition from operator to instructor would prove more challenging than any mountain evacuation, forcing Maria to confront questions about leadership, legacy, and what it truly means to serve others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.